Right, I think that we are now live on Facebook. I'm just trying to get across to the LYME CRIME page to make sure that's right.
Broadcasting to the world. Yeah.
But hopefully we're broadcasting blind as we sit here. We'll get there in just a moment once we get to the page. Hang on one moment. This should be much easier than this. It should be much more straightforward than this, but it's not. We just want to make sure that we are on screen talking before we really get going. So I'm going to scroll down and happening now. Yes, we can see you. Cool. It's jumping between us depending on which one speaks. So I'm not sure that our clever gallery view works, but there we are. We click on there and here we are. I think that's right. Yes, there we are. That's what we're supposed to have. So well, with all that, it's 2 minutes past 11, so we've only taken 45 seconds or so to really get through the teething stuff. But this is Setting the Pace at LYME CRIME. I am Teddy Kent, and this is, if you look at the top of his screen, you'll see a different name. But honestly, this is Alex Knight, author of Hunted. I've also promised you that we're going to have Mason Cross, and we do indeed have Mason Cross, who is sitting in exactly the same box, sitting in exactly the same place as both Gavin and Alex Knight, and that's Mason Cross because, as I'm sure you're already knowing, all completely clear already, that is two separate writing names for the same incredibly talented person. So
it's all very confusing.
It is. So
next book, I'm just going to be a symbol like Prince in the 90s. Going to be sort of whatever the book's called and just weird squiggle.
Well, that's got to work. It's got to be at least as confusing, isn't it? So I'm going to call you Alex for today, and if I slip into Mason or Gav, I apologise. But we're going to try and stick to Alex for as long as we're talking about Hunted. The title of today's panel is Setting the Pace, and what we're here to talk about, if we ever get to it, is really how to write, or how we think you should go about writing a page turner, a pot boiler, or whatever you want to call it. I know actually, Alex, that Kaz Green is running a course on this at the moment. So we should probably have brought her in, and she could have given us a proper full-on discussion and explanation of how you do this.
She probably told me how to do it for the next book, which right now would really come in handy.
Yeah, I'm having exactly the same problem. I'm setting the pace in such a way that I'm not really following it myself at the moment. It's jumping all around. It's not.
That might be a good sign.
Well, we hope. I'm going to move over to so I can see Facebook, and we're going to actually just hope that this is working properly while we're there, because in case any messages come up while we're on here. So,
I always like the Alan Partridge view of broadcasting to the internet, where you've got a potential audience of 7 billion. So hopefully this is our most attended panel that we've ever done.
Well, that's exactly it, isn't it? We don't know who's watching. We don't know how many there are. 11, according to this. I'm just hoping that if anyone sends us a question, it will come up. But I'm not going to allow myself to get distracted by the technology. I'm just going to talk to this little dot that I'm looking at up here. I know I can see you. Right, so as we've already said, we're going to talk about setting the pace and things like that, but I think the best way to do that is to talk about how we actually go about writing, and the best way to do that, I think, is to talk about the books that we've most recently written, and yours has been out the most recently, which was last week, and that was Hunted, and that's in the name Alex Knight.
That's right. Yep, it was actually out on Thursday, which I discovered yesterday is quite an auspicious date because it shares a birthday with Rosemary's Baby. Rosemary's Baby was born on the 25th of June, and that's because it's exactly half a year since Christmas Day. So,
right.
I thought that was quite nice that they share a birthday. So,
just to reassure everybody, I've read Hunted, and there's nothing in Hunted that makes anybody worry in terms of Satan or anything like that.
Not overtly, no. So, well, I just sort of talk about
yes, tell us a bit about it.
And I guess the idea came from, I was chatting to my editor, and she had just done, she'd sort of transferred to the New York office of the publishing group that owns my publisher, for a few months just to work over there, which sounded fantastic. And when she was there, they tried out this new thing called the Presidential Alert,
Yeah.
which is basically the ability of the president to send a message to everybody's phone. So the idea is if there's like a terrorist attack or a natural disaster, they can get information out quickly. And obviously, given the current incumbent of the White House, people were a bit concerned that he would just start using this every day just to sort of angrily tweet to everybody in the country at 2 o'clock in the morning. But she just thought, that's, a really cool sort of new technology, and maybe that could be some sort of hook for a thriller. And I started looking into it, and it uses this technology called the Integrated Public Alert Warning System, or IPAWS for short. And it doesn't rely on text messages or people having the internet on or anything. It can actually just broadcast it straight to any cell phone or any smartphone within a particular area. And there are a few different ways this is used, and one of them, getting away from natural disasters and terrorist attacks, one of them that I thought might be a bit more interesting for what I wanted to do was a thing called the Amber Alert. And this is something that they've had actually for 20 or 30 years in the States, where if a child goes missing, they send out what's called an Amber Alert, and that just gives information about the child that's gone, and if they've got a suspect, particularly if they've got a vehicle. And in the olden days, that used to be, that used to be emails, and it used to be sending to the media, and they could get that information out reasonably quickly. But obviously with this new international IPAWS system, they can just immediately send it to 4 million cell phones in a particular area. And I thought that would be really interesting to do if they got the wrong guy and somehow somebody is blamed for this, and then suddenly has 4 million people looking for them or hunting them, if you will. So that kind of, once I sort of thought of that scenario, the first chapter basically wrote itself. I wrote that really, really quickly. That starts with one of the protagonists of the book hears banging in his door at 7 o'clock in the morning. He sort of runs to see what it is, opens the door, and it's the daughter of his girlfriend, and she's covered in blood and kind of terrified. And she says her mom's been shot. She thinks she's dead. And he gets her inside the apartment, tells her to sit down, says they're going to get some help. He runs to get his phone, and before he can touch it, it lights up, and it's an Amber Alert saying that a child's been abducted and they've got a suspect, and the suspect is him.
I've read that chapter again this morning because
it's nice and short, so
it's a fantastic chapter, and it's a fantastic opening to a book. And when we're talking about how you write a page turner, I think that the beginning, the very first chapter, has got to grab you. And I have to say, much as the very first line of your first book did, I have to say that the first chapter of Hunted is absolutely just, it's like a lesson in how to grab somebody. Wow. The principle of the Amber Alert is just, it's a fantastic hook for a book. It's a fantastic thing to do. I think we spoke about this before. I said to you, it reminded me a little bit of the scene in the Denzel Washington film Fallen, where, the premise of that is there's a demon that can pass from person to person by touch. And it just means that everyone is a potential bad guy, no matter how innocent, no matter how good. They're all potential bad guys from the perspective of your hero. And I think that's the beauty of Hunted, isn't it? You've got Jake Ellis, you've got Molly, the little girl, and they're on the run. Well, he's on the run, but he's trying to protect her at the same time. And that's all I'll say, obviously, because it's your book and we want people to read it. But it's just, it's a thrilling book. It's one of, just so everyone can know this is completely true. It's one of my two favourite books that I've read this year. And one of my favourite books I've read. It's just fantastic. It really is.
Thanks so much. That was absolutely something I was looking to tap into. Just that paranoia and that sense that everybody is a potential bad guy from your point of view. And you mentioned Fallen. I thought about the sort of 70s version of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which is a big reason why I set the book in San Francisco, where you've got Donald Sutherland and everybody might be a pod person, and you only know when they point at you and start screaming. Somebody that reviewed the book recently actually picked up on something I hadn't even thought about. I don't know if you've seen the last couple of John Wick movies. I take
yes.
Action movie fan, Tony.
We'll talk about that soon, I'm sure.
I think it's the end of John Wick 2, where they just put out a contract on him, and basically because everybody in New York in the John Wick universe is a hitman, everybody gets a message saying go kill John Wick. And I hadn't even thought of that, but I guess that's
no, it's very similar. I mean, luckily for Jake Ellis, the people don't have the same skills as the guys who get the message.
Yeah,
John Wick.
But everybody isn't a ninja.
That'd be a really short book.
But it's interesting that there are a few things like that, and it obviously taps into something kind of modern about, you look at, Twitter storms and sort of people sort of being suddenly piled upon, and it's that sort of sense that suddenly everybody in the world can become against you. So I think it is actually, I've sort of looked into quite a sort of current hook for a thriller, just that sense that everybody's against you and everybody kind of really is against them in this book.
I mean, you're right. It seems when you look at it from, if you read it and then just take it out even slightly into the real world, and move away from the Amber Alert, but exactly what you just said, things like Twitter pylons and things like that. It's really very current, isn't it? It's a much more violent sort of heightened version, but it's very, very current in the sense that this person can do nothing, or maybe just send something that they thought was perfectly innocent, and then they are the enemy of the state.
Yeah. Exactly.
It's really very good in that way. I mean, we spoke earlier about your other incarnation as Mason Cross, and of course there's also ML Cross for what you saw last night, which was your
MJ Cross.
MJ Cross.
So how many names am I up to now?
I have no idea. I'm still struggling just to stick to Alex for the purposes of this. But what you saw last night, of course, was your standalone, almost sort of modern Agatha Christie-esque Murder on a Train. But you're most well known, of course, for your first 5 books, which are in the Carter Blake series. And Hunted is a bit of a departure from that, isn't it? You wouldn't want people to think that they're getting that kind of a book, because it's not really that kind of a book, is it?
Yeah, and I think that was part of the reason behind a new name for this, because it is sort of it's. I was about to say it's in a different universe. Technically, they are in the same universe because there's one guest character that appears in both, but yeah, it's definitely it's more that kind of normal people thing, whereas the Blake books, he's a bit more of a James Bond. He's a bit more capable. He is. Have I frozen?
Yeah. No, you haven't frozen. I was trying to check if we had any questions as you were talking.
We're just getting unfortunately to that thing of like when people suddenly look concerned, you're like, okay, I've frozen. That's probably
it wasn't that.
Yeah.
Blake,
Blake was definitely my attempt at doing that more kind of heightened thing, that more Bourne Identity 24 James Bond thing. And Hunted, although it's got that big technological hook, it's it's a hook that it's possible in real life, so it is a little bit more grounded. I mean, we've been talking about my book all the time, but we've not actually talked about Power Play yet. I'm conscious, and you've got a pretty grabbing first chapter as well for that one.
Yeah, well, going back to what we're here for, technically we're here to talk about writing a page turner. And again, I'm a big believer in that same thing. I'm a big believer that you've got to grab the audience right at the beginning by the scruff of the neck. I try to do that in Power Play by writing a scene on a Boeing 747 that's flying over the Atlantic. And as it's making its way across, we get to know a little bit about the crew. We get to know, one of the pilots is seemingly in some sort of relationship with one of the stewardesses. I'm sure that's fairly realistic. and we're knowing a little bit about some celebrity who's occupying the first class cabin, who's some politician of some note. And then what I've tried to add in there, which is actually not completely dissimilar to how you've actually planned the most of Hunted. With Hunted, you begin now, and then your second chapter goes back to 57 minutes or 58 minutes before. Yeah. So what I've done is not dissimilar to that, but all in one chapter, which is the chapter begins with 3 minutes, and then we have a little chat, get to know people, then 2 minutes, then the chat continues, know a bit more, 1 minute, we know a bit more, then 1 second, and then hellfire, basically. The plane explodes, there's a bomb on the plane. All the people that I've tried quite hard in the short amount of pages to make you think you're going to get to know, you don't get to know. And it's an explosion, it's a bomb on a plane, and it kind of sets off the entire plot that follows, which sort of takes place in America and the UK. The plane was flying from JFK, so in the UK, the person who put the bomb on the plane is being investigated, and he's being represented by my ongoing recurring lawyer character, Michael Devlin. And then over in America, my other ongoing character, Joe Dempsey, is now at the UN International Security Bureau, and he's tasked with finding out who would benefit most from the death of a politician who was in fact a fairly nailed on presidential candidate. So
yeah.
That's the premise that's the setup for Pamphlet.
But it's such a great first chapter because, as you say, you spend these pages developing all these different characters and asking all these questions that really interest the reader. And you've all the time you've got this ticking clock in the background, which actually we'll probably come back to as a great technique for pacing things, because it creates tension. You're wondering what are we counting down to. You probably get an idea as you move through the pages what's going to happen, but then you get to the end of that chapter, and as you've said, everybody you've just spent all this time introducing us to is gone, and you really it gives you the sense that anything can happen in the book. So you've got all these questions and all these people are suddenly taken off the board, and then you're introduced to kind of the real cast of the book, if you like. But that really sort of I think I read that at Disneyland Paris, and sort of I was in a queue and didn't want to actually sort of get it right before I got to the end of that.
I remember you wrote me that as a potential blurb, and unfortunately my publisher said we'll get sued by Disney. My response, which was, well, they've got no grounds to sue us. Yes, they got lots of money.
It'll be, you don't need grounds. Yeah.
You don't need grounds.
That's probably actionable as well.
We've got a quick question coming in, so I think we'll deal with them as they come. Michelle Buckeridge on Facebook has said,
Hi, Michelle.
Hi, Michelle. Thanks for contributing. I have a question. Do you think chapter length has a bearing on pace, i.e. the longer they are, the slower the pace? Or do you think as long as each one ends in a cliffhanger, that makes the reader want to keep going and it doesn't matter? What do you think?
I think for me, I certainly find it easier with shorter chapters to up the pace. I don't necessarily think a book will be slower paced if it's got long chapters, because a lot probably depends on the skill of the writer and what kind of atmosphere they're trying to build up. So it might be if they want to create a lot of tension, longer chapters work better. For me, I certainly find that the pacier books I've written definitely have more chapters. This one, I think, is the most chapters I've ever had in a book. It's under 400 pages and it's got 102 chapters. And I found that really helped me keep the pace up, just cutting back and forward between the cast of characters. And you use reasonably short chapters as well, don't you, Tony?
I do. I kind of naturally write them short. I'm writing my fourth at the moment, and as I'm writing it recently, I've been thinking every time I finish a chapter, I'm thinking, God, it's another 3-page chapter. And just to stop it being uniform 3-page chapters going on, I'm trying to stretch some of them out. And when the edit comes, we'll probably just take all those extra bits out and it'll go down to 3 pages. I think there's a certain natural tendency towards pace when you're writing a pacey book. And I think that if you read James Patterson stuff, if you read the pure James Patterson stuff, it's very, very much what he does. He writes very short chapters, and I never intended to do that. It was never intentional at all. But I just found as I became better at keeping pace up, it seemed that the chapters just stayed that short. But when they need to be longer, they have to be longer. I mean, as you say, that when I was writing Marked for Death, my second book, there were court scenes. And you cannot write a court scene short. If you're going to write, as I did, a cross-examination based upon self-cite material, it's complicated, and you can't possibly get people to understand it in 5 pages. Yeah. So I wrote sort of 25 and even 30-page chapters in that, but surrounded by the same 3 or 4 pages for the rest of the story. So I think it's whatever you need, but I do think that the natural pace comes from shorter chapters, but I don't think it's intentional. I don't think you're meaning to do it. I think it's just a natural thing. And in terms of cliffhangers at the end of chapters, I think that, again, if you're a pacey writer, it just seems natural to end it you're not intending to have a cliffhanger every time, but it just seems natural to be where it is.
Yeah, and I think some people, I always say that as well. Harlan Coben writes short chapters, and he almost always has some kind of cliffhanger at the end of the chapter. Yeah. And when you say that, it doesn't need to be, literally life and death cliffhanger. It just needs to be, you're kind of asking a question at the end of each chapter that the reader wants to know, and that will carry them forward to read the next chapter. Yeah. So it can be, the phone rings and you think, oh, who's that? Or it could be somebody turns up with a gun, that old Chandler thing, somebody walks through the door with a gun. And I think also having different points of view helps with that too, because you can have something at the end of a chapter, and then you make them wait a chapter to tell them what's going to happen after it.
I think that's something you and I both do. Again, it's a natural thing. I think it maybe comes from what you like to read. I mean, I love to read books like that. You love to read books like that, I know. And the reality is you're kind of writing what you love. And there's a real beauty to that. We're not writing something that's commercial because it's commercial. We're writing something that we both really enjoy. Yeah. And so you can't help but emulate that. We have some more questions. I'm really excited about this. This is great. Will Dean has come on. Will, how are you? Will has written 3 books while we've been talking, which is really frustrating. But before we get to Will's question, someone beat him to it, Judith Williams. Judith, do you think events in the US will make it difficult in future to write books set there, given that fiction can't compete with reality? I'm going to jump in on this, Judith, and I'm going to say, you need to read this. Because there are some similarities. But no, it's a good question. I think it's more, do you know something? I don't think, like if I can jump in with my answer on this one, I don't think it's that damaging to what we write. What we write is heightened. It's as real as we can be, but it's still kind of heightened. I can tell you, as a barrister, there aren't many barristers going out there getting into fist fights and shooting terrorists. So what we write is kind of real life, and then try to exaggerate it and make it entertaining. And I think that there's just a little bit more exaggeration we could possibly add now, thanks to what's going on over there. I think if you wrote satire, then you're in real trouble, because how can you satire real life that seems satirical in itself? But I think for a page turner, for this kind of thing, it means we can probably push the boat a bit further. We can probably go a little bit sort of more extreme in what we want to write, and that can allow us to go off on a flight of fancy a bit more.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, 10 years ago, you were probably, or I wasn't writing books 10 years ago, but I would imagine writers would have been more sensitive to accusations that that's too far-fetched or that would never happen in the real world. And these days, it's you would struggle to say anything would never happen. With who's in the White House just now, with everything that's going on with coronavirus, it's we're living in sort of fairly extreme times. So it seems like, if anything, it's probably difficult to write something so extreme that it would stand out as being in any way unlikely. I mean, you're in kind of a good position, because your books are, because of the latest book, Power Play, you deal with the upper echelons of power in the United States and the world. So you've got the president in that book. So I remember you saying, in a way, you're almost working in a parallel universe already. Yeah. So that probably, I would imagine, gives you some advantages. Like, you can probably ignore coronavirus for the time being if you want to.
Do you know what? I fully intended to. As you know well, and as others may know, I was writing a book that was about a pandemic, and I decided, no way am I writing that book. I was sick with coronavirus for one thing and some other stuff, and I just thought, I'm not writing it. So I put it away, and I'll come back to it in the future, I'm sure. It wasn't about coronavirus, but it was a pandemic. So I then went back to write my book 4, and my head was, there is going to be no coronavirus in this book. And it's now a really key motivation for one of the bad guys. It's effectively, I've got a patriot movement that had gone into abeyance. Mm-hmm. But then, because the president, or my president, not Trump, because my president had effectively shut the country down to deal with it, all the anti-federalists had got up in arms, and there was a resurgence in this movement, and they're now a danger again. So it's become really important to an underlying thing with the plot. So yeah, I mean, I am in that place. I do live I write in a parallel world. I mean, the place that I know changes must be 1997, because we had a different peace process in Northern Ireland in my books. So from 97 onwards, whether it's the same world to before that, who knows? But I know at the moment I can pick that one point where it diverts. And yet I do try to bring as much stuff in as we can. But it is interesting. It's a very interesting question. But I think it frees us a little bit. I've got a question from Will Dean, as I said, we'll go back to. Will's written another book since we last mentioned him. Question for both of you. What's your favourite opening line or scene in a book? And I'm going to answer this first because I want to jump on this. One of my favourite opening lines in a scene or a book is by a chap called Mason Cross in his first ever book, Killing Season. And I think the line is, correct me if I'm wrong, but was it Carter Blake? The first thing you need to know about me is that that's not my name. And I think it's absolutely fantastic. I think it sets one of my favorites, absolute favorite series at the moment and going forward is a Carter Blake series. Mason, Alex knows this is true because I've told him many times. So it's not for the purposes of this. Anyone who hasn't read them, you need to get them. Killing Season, the beginning of that set the scene for a series better than I believe I've ever seen anyone else do. Because you know everything you need to know about Carter Blake in that one line. He's an enigma. And he's not really Carter Blake. And just what follows from that is so consistent. It's a great opening line, but then when you read all 5 books, it's a fabulous opening line. It makes so much more sense. So my answer is it's one of my favourite one is Mason's.
Oh, thanks very much.
Well, Alex.
It's sort of one of the favourite. Weirdly enough, it's a line I had before I had the book or the character. I just thought that'd be good opening for a story. And I remember that was one of the things my editor said, that when she started reading the book, that was one of the things that really sold it to her, was that opening line, and they used it in the blurb. And I liked it because it was quite economical, because it told you quite a lot in just a few words, and just set this guy up as a bit mysterious, and you knew that you would probably have to spend the next few books finding out a bit more about his background.
Yeah.
But it's a big compliment. Thanks, Tony. So I feel like I should run and get your book and find out what...
No, absolutely not. We can't do that.
You have great opening lines too. To be honest, I think most thrillers do have to open with a good opening line. That's maybe most books. And something I've always liked to do is, if I'm browsing in a bookshop, I will look at the opening line and the closing line of a book. Doesn't need to be a crime book, because it's always that, I think, always tells you quite a lot about a writer. So if I'm in two minds about whether to pick up a book, I will look at the last line and the first line and see if they jump out. My mind has gone completely blank about what my favourite opening line is. There's so many great ones. Obviously, there's Rebecca.
Yeah.
The opening line of the Big Sleep, I couldn't go anywhere near quoting it, but just when it's Philip Marlowe talking about what he's wearing and how he's getting prepared for this meeting with this rich general who has a job for him, that's a really good one. And most of Chandler's stories have really great intros. When we come off this, I'll think of 12 million great opening lines. But
I'm doing a panel tomorrow, so I'll open with that in a second. We've got some more questions. Karen Hewlett, hi Karen, has said other short author book recommendations welcome. We'll deal with. I'll shout one out, Karen. I would say.
Not that sure.
Sorry?
I'm 5'10".
I'm 6'2". Come on, you're talking to the wrong people. In terms of short books, so rather than short chapters, well, in terms of short chapters and relatively short books, I think the person I'm enjoying the most at the moment would be Neil Broadfoot. He writes very, very pacey, very similar sort of stuff to myself and to Alex Mason, but he's a shorter. They're certainly shorter than ours. And if you're talking about books that you can pick up and you don't want to pick down and you can fly through them, Neil, you can't go wrong with Neil.
Yep, I back that up as well. Neil's a great writer, and I think he's about 5'11", 6 feet. So
yeah, he's somewhere in between.
Within the same height range.
And then we've got Emma Mitchell was asked about COVID, but I think we've addressed that, Emma. So I hope you won't be offended if we jump on. Louise Fairbairn. Considering you have to watch the pace so carefully, do you plot or not? Alex?
Yes and no. I like to, I'm in between, like everybody is, everybody comes back with the response that they're either a pantser, which is they're writing by the seat of their pants, or a plotter, and they plot everything in detail. And I'm kind of a bit of both. I like to have 4 or 5 pages of an outline, and then I will know how to write from that. And just kind of make up a bunch of stuff around that and improvise, and it will usually end up 70% of what was in the outline. Where the plotting comes in for me is actually counterintuitively after I've written a couple of drafts, and then I will go back and try and make sure the pace works, and the different points of view are distributed fairly evenly. And something that actually is really important for setting the pace is having a really firm grip of the time frames, and when everything happens, how long it takes to get from A to B, what character 1 is doing when character 3 is in this location. And to do that, the first time I really got into trouble juggling all those considerations was writing the third book, which was published as The Time to Kill, where I had about 5 different points of view. I had 2 time frames, flashbacks, and I had people on different ends of the American continent. So I was juggling with different time zones and different times. And I ended up having to have this giant spreadsheet with the chapter, a bit of information about what happens in the chapter, which character was narrating the chapter, and what time it was. So, and because this was in different time zones, I had to have what time it was locally and what time it was GMT. And it was an absolute nightmare to pull it together. But once I'd done that, it really flowed, and I was able to, I knew exactly where everybody was. And I've done that for every book since, which really came in handy on the copy edit for Hunted, because copy editors, obviously, as most people will know, is the person that goes through and really nitpicks the book, which is intensely irritating when you're reading the comments, but so valuable, because you want the copy editors to pick you up on the fact that you've got somebody who's bald on page 2 and has a full head of grey hair on page 4. But one of the things they picked me up on was, hey, well, there's been 4 chapters since this happened at 6 o'clock, and wouldn't it be dark by now? And I was able to go back and say, well, no, because this takes place between 7:03 p.m. and 7:07 p.m. in San Francisco on the 25th of April, when sunset is at 7:50 p.m. So it felt nice and smug doing that. That was probably a much more long-winded answer than you were looking for, Louise. Tony's probably going to be much more concise.
Well, you've basically answered for me, because I do very much the same as you. Can I just say, as an aside, before I come back to it, there is nothing better than telling an editor they're wrong, is there? Because they're so rarely wrong.
I know, yeah. I mean, 99% of the time they're annoyingly, infuriatingly right, but it's nice to be able to go back and say, actually. No.
I'm Power Play. Power Play ends in a particular way, and I'd ended it differently, and the ending was. The ending was very much, all the same bad guys got their comeuppance. Everyone, there was the same justice done to everyone, but the end chapter was justice done in a slightly different way to one of them. And I loved what I'd written. I was really excited about it. It was an unusual ending. And my editor came back and said, yeah, it's great, and gave me a number of reasons why it had to change. And I wanted to strangle her as if I reached through the screen. I was like, oh, I love this, you just don't get it. But I'm always of the view, I'm going to rewrite it, like you say, to prove you wrong. And I've never rewritten it without proving myself wrong. It's so frustrating. Yeah. So when you get those opportunities where you can say, well, actually, you've got the sunrise wrong on that one, they're great. But no, just to go back to what Alex said, and to answer the question, exactly the same. I'm writing my 4th book at the moment, as I said. It opens up in the Florida Keys. It's very important when the sun rises. It's very important when things happen. I'm a certain way in now, and I know how many minutes I am from the opening chapter. It opens with a bang, because as I said earlier, that's a great way to keep up pace, is to start with a firing pistol or a starter's pistol. And I know how many minutes I am. I'm 100, however many hundreds of pages, however many 1,000 words in, but I know how many minutes have passed since then. And I think that really is helpful. I really do.
It is, and it's the sort of thing the reader is never going to know that you know that, but the fact that you do know it really impacts how good the book is. I think the fact that you're that on top of the detail. Yeah.
Question now, which I think is quite a good one, slightly away from setting the pace, but it's again Karen Hewlett. Thanks, Karen, for getting involved so readily. Which book that you have written is your favourite?
The approved answer to this is always the latest one. But then you get, you see like Noel Gallagher being interviewed and said, yeah, this is our best album yet, man. And he doesn't believe it. But I mean, Hunted's definitely up there. That's one of the favourite books I've written. I like to think we're both early enough in our careers that we can still honestly say that our recent book is as good as, stuff that we've done before, hopefully better, because we're improving with every book. I mean, Hunted's definitely one of my favourites. My favourite Blake one would probably be between Time to Kill, or Winterlong as it's called in the States, and Presumed Dead. And Presumed Dead was a little different from the other Blake books because it was a bit more of a mystery, a bit less of an action thriller, and it was the one that had a kind of big twist at the end without giving too much away. And it was a bugger to get it to work, but the fact that I seem to have got it to work to the satisfaction of most readers is something I'm quite proud of.
Yeah.
I think for me, Power Play is your best book so far. I don't know what.
Yes, very kindly. I'd agree with that. I think it is. Yes, it's only my third book. I think I've been learning very much how to write since the first book I wrote. It took me years because I was writing on and off during my day job. And I didn't have it, as everybody does. I started it when I was in my 20s and then didn't touch it for 10 years or 12 years or something. And so that's much more of a put together book. You know, you can see how many drafts there have been. Power Play, I found it easiest to write, and it flowed naturally better than the others because I think I'd learned to write by then. And hopefully I'll be able to keep that up with the future books. But yeah, my favourite is Power Play. The other thing is I came up with the Michael Devlin and the Dempsey characters together. And I was always intending my series to be about them both. But because Dempsey doesn't really appear in the second book, my idea was that I'd alternate. I'd have introduced them both Killer Intent, then we'd have a Devlin book, then we'd have a Dempsey book and a Devlin book. I wrote the first two books on that basis and then was told by my publishers, no, Devlin needs to be in the third book because it's the Devlin series. And I was saying, no, it's not. It's the Devlin Dempsey series. So I hadn't realised we weren't entirely on the same page on that one. And so Power Play I like for a very specific reason is that everyone had kind of assumed it was the Devlin series, pardon me. And that was a big problem for me because it really wasn't. I mean, Dempsey has always been as big. You know yourself, when you write a character, they mean something to you. Yeah. And Dempsey meant something to me every bit as much as Devlin did. And I hadn't realised that he didn't mean something to everyone in the same way. So I had a real pleasure with writing Power Play because I was able to just make people understand Dempsey as a main character.
It's got a slight sort of kind of Marvel Universe feel that you do feel like there are two protagonists in the book. So it's that sort of Avengers thing where it's not just the Michael Devlin book or Joe Dempsey book. It's both of them, but they're both people that could carry a book. So I think that's one of the things that actually really made it stand out among your others.
That's very kind. And the next one is purely Joe Dempsey because, as I said, I'd abandoned the the pandemic book and had to just grab another one-line idea that I had and just get going with it. And unfortunately, I just couldn't think of a way without shoehorning him, and I would never want to do that, without shoehorning Devlin into the next book. I couldn't put him in it. So he's there at the beginning because there are things that kind of spiral off from things that have happened to him in the past and characters that have impacted him in the past. And therefore, you've got to know who he is. And then Dempsey gets back to America and it all kicks off in America. And so it's a Dempsey book. And then the next one that I'll be doing after that is, again, completely a 50-50, which will all be taking place in the International Criminal Court. So that's very much Devlin doing his job in the court and Dempsey ensuring that the correct witnesses make it alive to court. So yeah, it's going back to the question, Power Play for me is, I would honestly say, is my favourite. But going back to your answer, I have to say, I've said already, one of my absolute favourite series is the Carter Blake series. But Alex Knight's book is better than Mason Cross's books. It's your best. It really is.
Well,
if you don't mind me saying.
It's nice to hear that your most recent one is the best one. Yeah. That's never going to be a bad thing to hear. So thanks very much.
And thanks for the question, Karen. Judith Williams says that Winterlong is her favourite Carter Blake or fave Carter Blake book. So someone's in agreement with you there.
Thank you.
Karen Cole, is there a difference between standalones and books in a series when it comes to setting the pace? That's a really good question, actually. For me at the moment, I've got an idea for a standalone that I'm hoping I might have time to write before I start the next one. And in my mind, I don't think I'm going to struggle with the pace there at all. However, very much like Mason, or Alex, whatever we're going to call you, very much like the other guy on the other, just like the other guy on the other screen. We try to write our books so that all of them can be treated as standalones. I don't think, it'd be crazy to write a book that nobody can read from scratch. And I've never had a struggle with that for Marked for Death or for Power Play. My next book is in a series. However, it's the first one where you need to know a bit more about the series in order to really, really get it. You can still read it without knowing more, but to really get everything out of it, you need to know a bit more. And I've struggled with that, I'll be honest. I've been struggling with keeping up the pace whilst laying down the exposition that is necessary to allow people to allow people to really understand what's going on. So I would say that depending on what the series, or where you are in the series, and you know, the connection between the particular book and the rest of the series, I think would have, you know, would affect the answer to that question. Terrible answer. I'm sorry. I don't know where I'm going with that.
I get, my instinct would be it's probably easier in a standalone, but I don't know if I have any sort of backup for that statement. I guess in a standalone, you really can do anything. You could kill the protagonist if you wanted to. So I guess in some ways it's maybe easier to create that the sense of stakes, and particularly because standalones quite often they will focus on somebody who this is the most exciting thing that's ever happened to them, the most danger that they've ever been in. Whereas if you're dealing with, you know, John Rebus or Harry Bosch, you know that, like, you know, every year they get into the same sort of thing, and you love reading about it, but you're not too worried that they're going to get to the end of the book unharmed. So God, yeah, I think it's in some ways it's probably easier to make a standalone pacey because you don't have the weight of the backstory that you need to introduce in some respects for new readers. But I don't know. It probably, to be honest, it probably depends more on the story than the format. And I think because Hunted, for example, is a chase thriller, that made it probably impossible not to be pacey because you are literally setting the pace and on the run, and you have people following you. So that kind of story really lends itself to the pace.
I think that answers a couple of other questions we've had, and I agree with you completely. I think that it's actually not about standalone or series; it's about plot. If the plot requires pace and you're able to write pace, the plot will be pacey. Tyler Collins said, "Do you think character or plot is more important?" I think that probably answers a bunch of
both. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. But in terms of if we're looking at this from a pace point of view, I think it's plot is what's important as far as pace is concerned. Vicky Newham says again, what are the key things that slow pace down? Do you think? And I think in my long rambling answer, I kind of gave you my opinion on that. Exposition, the need for exposition, and how you can deliver it.
Yeah. Actually, the book I'm writing just now, sort of the inciting incident refers to something that happened 20 years ago, and in the first draft I had to write a 5,000 word chapter, which is sort of not the normal chapter length for me, about what happened 20 years ago, and it just killed the book. So I've had to sort of, having written that and knowing what happened in those 5,000 words, that has let me go back, cut all of that stuff out, and just kind of drip feed it a bit more throughout the book, and I think that's probably helped. So absolutely, exposition definitely slows things down. So if you can cut that to the minimum without confusing people, that's the sweet spot. Just on a purely technical sense, if you've got a lot of straight prose of people thinking and no dialogue, that will slow things down, because people will physically read a page of dialogue twice as fast as they'll read a page of somebody sitting down and having to think about surroundings. Yeah,
if you can write exposition into realistic dialogue, then I mean that's a fantastic talent if you can do that, because it really does it's so much more effective. The problem is a lot of people can't do that, and you read a lot of expositionary dialogue where you sit there thinking that is not how a human speaks.
Great example is Jim Cameron's script for the Terminator, because you've got all of this enormous amount of stuff that you have to introduce to the audience without sort of being able to show it because they don't have the budget to. And rather than having them sit down and explain, this is why I've been sent back from the future, Kyle Reese delivers all the necessary exposition in the middle of a car chase, just sort of yelling things out while sort of turning the wheel and sort of escaping from Arnold Schwarzenegger. And you don't really notice that it's exposition, but you absorb everything you need to know where we're at in the story.
And interestingly, an example of how not to do it is when the same man made Avatar. Because I think he's no longer a human. He doesn't know how humans speak anymore.
Well, that's a good example of somebody who doesn't need to listen to editors anymore, because he's so successful that they're not going to tell him what to do to make $1 billion for a movie.
Quick one, Neil Broadfoot. I've got to deal with this one because it's interesting. Neil, could Dempsey, Devlin, and Blake ever meet, and what would happen? Now, for my answer to that is I've never really thought about the good guys meeting. But when I read Killing Season, and I think I texted you about this, Alex, when I read Killing Season, my very first instinct was Caleb Wardell. What a bad guy. What a great bad guy. I wonder if he could take Joshua, who was my bad guy in Killer Intent. And it was really interesting because I actually did. It was in my immediate reaction. He was such a good bad guy, and it opened so well with him that I was like, yeah, maybe, yeah, that would be really interesting to see those two guys against each other. So my reaction, my answer to the question is I've not really thought about the good guys, but I have pitched the bad guys.
That would be really cool. And it has to be a prequel because I think they're both dead.
Oh, no, Joshua's not.
Oh, is he? No, he's not.
He was in my first draft, and I was forced to get rid of the finality of that. Yeah, so you're not completely clear at the ending whether he will survive or not.
That was smart. Just sort of leave it open because that's what I didn't do.
Also, secretly very necessary for book 4. hence the need for so much bloody exposition.
I mean that's probably the favorite bad guy I've written is Wardell.
He's my favorite of your bad guys. He's fantastic.
In some ways, it almost felt like he was the protagonist. In some ways, I was sort of writing a lot of his scenes from his point of view.
Yeah.
And I was kind of concerned, actually, a lot of the sort of early readers really identified with him and sort of liked that character. So I made him a bit nastier in the final draft. But yeah, and I think that you've got to slightly identify with your bad guys to write a good bad guy.
Yeah.
But yeah, that'd be interesting to kind of team them up.
So. I'd like to know. Paddy, right, we're not going to answer this question in any length, Paddy, but we have to address it because you're the boss. So who is your favourite Bond? Or do we need another 2 hours to debate this thorny issue? We absolutely need another 2 hours. My answer is, if we're talking about films, then it's Connery. If we want to talk about who is closest to the books, then it's Dalton. But this could be such a big issue.
There's no debate, it's Connery. Definitely Connery. I like Dalton as well. Dalton is really underrated. Living Daylights is one of the best ones. That was the first Bond I saw in the cinema, which probably skews my love for it a little bit. But that's it. Going back, it just really holds up. Apart from when he joins the Taliban to fight the Russians. But apart from that, it was the 80s. Yeah. Rambo was doing it.
Rambo had already done it. I was surprised when any Russians left after Rambo was there. Neil Lancaster. Hi, Neil. I was about to just read on as if you were Neil Broadfoot, but no, Neil Lancaster. How you doing? Neil, when I read
everybody's height, so...
when I read either of you... How tall are you, Neil? Come on, tell us. We need to know. But when I read either of your books, I'm reminded of some of the old school thrillers like Desmond Bagley, Alistair MacLean. The pacing feels similar. Either of you take inspiration from that era of books. He then says, I appreciate you're both younger than me. Alex, do you want to take this?
Actually, you're not the first person to name check Alistair MacLean, and to my shame, I've not actually read any of his books yet. I've got one within sight of me that when my grandpa died, I cleared out all of his old Pulp Fiction, and he had a bunch of Alistair MacLean books and Desmond Bagley as well. And just great old sci-fi paperbacks. So I've got those for probably waiting for when I retire to work through. So I'd love to read some of those sort of classic practitioners. Robert Ludlum, I've probably been quite inspired by reading his stuff. Ian Fleming, obviously. I love the movies that were made out of the Alistair MacLean books, Guns of Navarone and Where Eagles Dare. So that stuff probably does feed in. That's kind of, I think we're both sort of aiming for that part of the market if it still exists, which hopefully it does.
Well, I was going to, before I make my comment on that, I just want to say Neil apparently is 5'10" and a half.
5'10".
Yeah, that's just someone trying to beat you. that's and a half. Right. Right. My answer to that question, I think actually is as more of a discussion point, really. I have read those books. And I think those books are the original inspiration for the films that I loved. I think that's where that comes from. And so, and Neil Lancaster, 5'10" and a half, Neil Broadfoot, come on, we know you're 5'11".
There's got to be a panel next year.
This has to be a panel next year. And no one taller than 6'2" is allowed on it, so that I can be the tallest. But no, they are, I think those books, I have read them and I do very much enjoy them, but I would be lying to say that they were my original inspiration. I'm really kind of inspired by certain writers, but also very much by film. And I know that Alex is as well.
Yeah.
And so I kind of look at the look at good thrillers on screen as being an extension of our genre. I don't think there's a huge difference. I think that there's a difference in approach and how you have to what you have to do to achieve it. But I think we're writing to entertain people in the same way that that James Cameron in his glory days was making films to entertain people. And so I think that maybe I think that these kinds of the Alistair MacLean stuff particularly inspired a lot of films and in its own genres. And I think that's kind of where the films that we watch now, I mean, we spoke about John Wick earlier in its own way, it's like mixed with video games, very much where that came from. And so I think I'm a very visual writer. I certainly see things very visually, whether I can pull it off or not. I'm certainly a very visual, in my mind, a very visual writer. That for me is the main
feedback that I often get is that it would make a great movie, which is a bit cliche, but it's certainly when I read your books, you can really visualize it and think what this scene would look like.
Well, and that's my favorite reaction. I've got my favorite my favorite comment in anything is either that they like the characters, because I worked a lot from Mark for that. When I went back to Killer Intent, I would admit that there are a few stock characters in there. I didn't pay enough attention to the non-main characters, whereas now I like to pay a lot of attention to non-main characters. I like the idea of them being, I want you to think, as with Power Play, that when you first meet them, they could be leading this whole book. So there's more sort of stakes in them when they die. And so, I like to have that as a review. But my main thing that I love in a review is, this is very cinematic, or this could be a film, etc., etc. Because then I know I've achieved what I want to achieve. Okay. I think we're running short of questions, unless anyone wants to throw some in. So Neil Lancaster again, remind me to read what I believe is one of the greatest opening lines of a book tomorrow from Desmond Bagley. Just so everyone knows, at the same time tomorrow, 11 a.m., there is another panel where you're going to be subjected to me, but you're also going to be subjected to, amongst others, Neil Lancaster. And he's going to read us his favourite opening line from Dennis Bagley. Emma Mitchell's... Sorry.
No, just interested to see what that is.
Yeah, so am I, actually. Emma Mitchell, I had to step out for a bit. I hope this hasn't been discussed. Going slightly off topic, I'd love to know which fictional character do you wish you'd created? Honest answer for me, Harry Potter, frankly, because come on. You can say stuff on Twitter that makes the world hate you, but who cares? You've got £1 billion. Honest answer, no one really. I'm quite happy with who I've got. Apart from wanting to, I'd love to have the success that has come with certain characters, but I think once you get this far in, maybe 3 books in, certainly it's not that far, but still 3 books in. I know that Neil Lancaster very much with this because he's very, very much into his character of Novak, and he very, very sort of deeply cares about Novak, and I'm much the same with Dempsey and Devlin. As I said earlier, Power Play was a pleasure to write because I was able to really embrace Dempsey, and hopefully get people to know, to feel for him the way I feel for him. So I'm happy with who I've got, if I'm honest.
Yeah, I think I'm the same. And there's always this, similar to the question about, is there a book that you wish you'd written? I think, if you wrote the book, it would be different from the one that you love. So it's good having those things out there and doing your own thing. In terms of characters I would like to write, I would love to write a Batman comic or a Bond book. So it would be cool to play with these characters that other people have created and do your own thing with them. But yeah, I'd still want the original versions to exist as well.
Yeah, well, as you know, I'm exactly the same in terms of to write characters who've been created. For me, it would be Superman.
I think it's a good almost an hour to get on a comic, so I'm quite impressed.
I know, I'm amazed. When we've got a drink in our hand, this is our first thing we ever discuss, especially because, and let's discuss this now, especially because Michael Keaton is going to be coming back as Batman in the DC universe. Now that's amazing.
Yeah. He was good, and he was one of the absolute highlights of the Spider-Man movie, the new Tom Holland one, a couple of years ago. Because up until that point, Marvel's villains, apart from Loki, had not been great, and he was just this amazing villain character that you actually completely understood his motivation for what he was doing.
Well, he was like he came from a proper film. I mean, I love comic book films. I'll hold my hands up and say I really enjoy them. However, they're not proper films. They're popcorn entertainment.
Sort of yeah, there's a production line.
They're a cookie cutter.
You can respect the craft that goes into that, but yeah, it does tend to end up a little bit. You know all the elements that are going to be out, and he was a big surprise, and the fact that they had a really great twist built around his character as well.
Well, when he has that scene sitting in the car, I mean, that was proper acting, like from a proper film, and I thought, hang on, this can't be Spider-Man. Vicky Newell, we've got another question. Do you have any views on how tense can affect pace? I've only ever written in one tense. I write everything immediate. I've had a couple of flashbacks, but I'm very immediate. I'm not the person to ask this, Vicky, because I'm not sure I could write in a different tense. So, Alex, what do you think?
That's a really good question. I've noticed a lot of the review copies I've been sent lately, there seems to be more that are written in the present tense. I do this, I walk out the door. And again, without sort of necessarily having any evidence to back that up, I wonder if that makes things more immediate, makes that a bit more tense, to think that this is actually happening now. Whereas, the more traditional way obviously is third person in the past. I quite like writing in the first person. Tense wise, I've not really given that much thought to why or how to do that. I don't think I've written in the present tense yet. No, correct me if I'm wrong. So I don't know.
I've not read it. If you have,
I don't know, Vicky, is the answer to that. But my sense is maybe in some ways it would make it easier to sort of ratchet up the tension if the reader subconsciously or consciously thinks, this is actually happening to this person as I'm reading it.
Yeah, I can see that. I can see why that would be. I can see what you could achieve with that. I'm just not confident I could achieve it. It's just, it's not the way that I write. We've had one question come through Twitter, and I think it's only right that we should read it out because
that was a good one. Yeah.
It was. And we'll wrap up with this, I think, because we are fast approaching the hour. Paul Stoddart, hopefully you're watching, or you'll be watching later on the YouTube. The YouTube, that makes me sound about 50, doesn't it? 60. I'm going to watch the YouTube. I'm going to watch the Family Guy on the YouTube. Who did you read when you were younger? Do you still find time to read? And who are your favourite authors? Alex?
Okay, will I go first?
Yeah.
Okay, so, well, we talked a little about this earlier on the Alistair MacLean question. Somebody I forgot to mention was John D. MacDonald, who wrote a series around a character called Travis McGee, who was really kind of the prototypical Jack Reacher. He was this guy that was basically kind of a beach bum. He lives on a boat, and people come to him with problems, and he has to get into adventures and solve these problems. And I really loved reading those books. It was my mum that put me onto them. She used to love sort of pulp fiction of any kind. And those really sort of, those influenced Carter Blake quite a bit as well. So I think I've been in good company with my influences with Lee Child, also taking inspiration from that. Obviously the Bond movies at first, and then when I went back and read the Bond books, you can still really get a lot from those, even though they're very much of a different time. Just the fact that Ian Fleming was very deliberately writing for a big commercial audience, and he wanted to tap into what people wanted to read about. And it's interesting actually to see in the history of thrillers how often that happens, because Frederick Forsyth did that with Day of the Jackal. He sat down and wanted to write a best-selling thriller. Ludlum did that with The Bourne Identity and the books that he wrote before that. And obviously Lee Child did as well. So it's quite interesting seeing somebody very deliberately try and write a commercial book, but make sure that they write a great book within that. And I think you can only do that if you love reading that stuff. So in a way, it's been lucky that I've liked reading all those guys growing up. Trying to think of anything else. Comics, obviously, big influence, and probably feeds into that visual thing that we were talking about earlier on. And the classics, Raymond Chandler, Dashiell Hammett, those guys. You can always learn a lot from them. Patricia Highsmith, another big one.
And now, who are your favourite authors now?
Now Stephen King's always a perennial. Love reading Stephen King. I'm just so far behind on the books. I need to actually just take a couple of months and catch up on Stephen
King. He can
King.
write faster than most people can read.
Yeah, he can write faster than I can read. And just your books I love. Ian Rankin is just, he always puts out a great rebus book every time. He somehow keeps getting better and better.
You can't go wrong, can you?
He's been great for 30 years. Gillian Flynn, I wish she would write a new book. She got into the sort of happy problem that her third book was so massive that she never needs to write another book again. And yeah, just I mean, one of the great things about going to the book festivals and hanging out with all you guys is you keep finding new people to read. And it's actually a whole new experience actually knowing somebody and then reading their book. So I read one of Abir Mukherjee's books for the first time at Christmas, and I've known him for a couple of years and sort of get on great at bars and stuff, but actually reading this fantastic book that somebody I know had written is just this sort of really interesting experience that I guess only we get to have.
In terms of my answer to the question, who did you read when you were younger? I've said many times in interviews, actually, I wasn't a big reader of our fiction when I was younger. I didn't realise it existed, to be honest. I used to read a lot of history, a lot of mythology, a lot of comics. And I only really got into, in terms of fiction, I read what the school told me to read. And, that's Wuthering Heights and stuff like that. And I don't think that was written for me. So I didn't really, I wasn't a big reader until I was 17. And then my uncle gave me The Winner by David Baldacci. And that just started a love affair with the whole thing. I read everything Baldacci had written and continue to date. I still think that his first 6 books or so were standalones. And I really think that his first 6 books are the best run of consistency in standalone thrillers, even to now, of anything I've read. I've still not read anything that beats The Winner. I've read some things that match it. I've not read anything that beats it. So I'd say, I can say clearly my favourite childhood author, if you count 17 as childhood, would have to be Baldacci, 100%. Do we still find time to read now? Yes. I mean, not as much as, weirdly, since I became technically a professional writer, I've read far less than I used to read because it's difficult because I've got a full-time job as well, and there's a lot of reading involved in that. But I still, we love what we write, and therefore we love what our friends write, and what Alex just said is right. Reading stuff that's written by people you know and people you like is a different experience, and it compels you to write. I mean, it's a read, part of me, even if it means staying up later to get it done. Favourite authors now? I've said Alex as Mason, Alex as Alex. And you mentioned Abir Mukherjee is just incredible. He's a great bloke, a very good friend of mine as well, but his books are just great. And his most recent, Death in the East, is just a work of art. I think it's absolutely incredible.
It's got that thing that you've learned so much as well, because historical fiction, actually, that's somebody in common with that is Laura Shepherd Robinson.
Yes, right? I'm actually literally, not as we speak, but this weekend, I'm working through a proof of her new one.
Yeah, and you can just get so absorbed in the worlds that these guys create. So,
I love that. Contemporary authors who you might not, I mean, we've mentioned Neil Broadfoot earlier, big fan of Neil's. I've read one of Neil Lancaster's. I'm hoping to read the rest of them as soon as possible. They're excellent Novak books. I would say that probably the lesser known person that I think is incredible is Judith O'Reilly. Just absolutely fantastic. Curse the Day is just, I think I gave it a blurb that said, if she keeps writing like this, the rest of us might have to pack up and go home. And so stop writing like that, Judith, if you ever see this recording. But yeah, so Judith O'Reilly, I recommend that. I recommend her books. Away from our genre, I love Flashman. I read Flashman repeatedly. It's one of those books that keep going back to. So that's the answer to that question. And I think we should probably wrap up. We're 5 minutes over time. Judith's on here. I'd never have said it if I knew you were there, Judith. Right, I think we should probably wrap up. Alex, Mason, whatever else. Any more names for today? MJ. And frankly, everyone can see Gavin as well, so there's no point pretending. It's been wonderful. I've really enjoyed this. I hope everyone else has enjoyed this. I hope it encourages you all to tune in tomorrow as well. I'm not sure what follows. I meant to have this in front of me. There'll be another panel on at 1 p.m. or 2 p.m. While I'm wrapping up. Hopefully Paddy, if he's still on here, will remind me. But there'll be another panel on after us, I think an hour later or slightly more. Thanks everyone for joining in. Do come along and watch everything else. I think this is the first live panel, and I'm hoping we've not completely screwed it up. But it's been a pleasure.
We'll just go off here and they'll say, yeah, that didn't actually go out to anybody.
I've actually, listen, you keep probably seeing me look away. That's not me bored of what you're saying. That's me making sure that it's working. I'm constantly checking between the two screens. It's an interesting process. So we will be back, or I will be back tomorrow at the same time, 11 a.m. with the Law and Order Lyme Regis panel. When we will have Imran Mahmood, who is a criminal barrister, myself, criminal barrister, Lisa Cutts, who is a detective in one of the Scottish police forces, and Neil Lancaster, who is an ex-detective with various very, very serious organisations in the Metropolitan Police. He'll tell you all about that tomorrow. We're also going to have, uniquely, His Honour Judge Nigel Lithman, QC. One of the best barristers, the best murder barristers in the country until about 4 years ago when he went to the bench, now one of the most senior judges in the country. I'm hoping that some of us will get a word in edgeways, but we might not. But from us, from myself, from Mason, Alex, Gavin, whoever else who wants to be today, I just want to say one more thing. Buy Hunted. It is absolutely brilliant. Go and buy it.
And also buy Powerplay.
Thank you. I knew you'd say that. Okay, thanks very much. Mason, Alex, see you. Thanks again.
See you. Sorry, we
Take
can't
care.
go for beer now.
We can't. That would be fantastic, wouldn't it? Everyone, bye.